Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. We still have a number of people joining, so just bear with us a moment. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Um, we're here today to talk about the new HPD New Construction Design Guidelines. A number of versions of this guidelines have been released over the years. Um, this latest version released in September of 2023, had some significant changes, particularly incorporating not only changes to the traditional design guidelines as you may know them, but incorporating other groups as well. And so with that in mind, I want to introduce some of my colleagues. We will have questions and answers at the end of this presentation. I'm Brian Baldor, Executive Director of New Construction Design Review in HPD Builds, joined by Mahan Shirazi, Deputy Director of Design Strategy, also in Builds. We're also joined with HPD Sustainability, Julia Lucci, the Senior Technical Climate Analyst, and Jasmine Reed Harris, the Sustainability Analyst. And from HPD Resiliency, we have Alan Zaretsky, the Director of Climate and Social Resiliency Planning and Policy, and Michael Nicholas, Senior Planner. Again, as mentioned, many of you may be familiar with past versions of our design guidelines. These are the last 3 iterations. The current design guidelines expands and includes in the process beyond the design review that some of you may be familiar with. Nonetheless, I want to call attention here on this slide, and there's a lot going on. These slides will be shared, so you don't have to memorize it all just yet. But in here and in blue is what you may be familiar with as the typical builds design review. Right there in the middle, where it says full builds design review, going to builds design acceptance and then loan closing. So for many of you in the past, that may be the phase during which you would engage in the design guidelines. Now we have expanded that, and as you see, there's an initial milestone that is related to our partners in sustainability and resiliency. There is an opportunity early on in the process, if a team has identified necessary waivers within the design guidelines, and we'll talk about what some of the requirements are. This is just a sort of an overview of process. To identify those early on, request a waiver. About 12 months prior to closing, you would be submitting for a design consultation. Now, for many of you, if you have been involved in special needs housing, you may have been in a design consultation with Builds before, or if you've had a project with us in the last 6 months, then your project may have gone through a design consultation. A design consultation is it's sort of an opportunity for everybody in HPD to come together all at once. And so the different groups that you see represented here as well as builds, design review, and of course planning. That is milestone 2, design consultation. That's now for all projects that are receiving HPD funding. And then you see going into the design review milestone. And again, going into what you've known before, perhaps under the full builds design review. We also, as part of the revised process, have created review tracks within builds and within sustainability and resiliency that provide different levels of review depending on the particular needs of the project. We will go into these in just a moment on the next slides. But want to call attention to the fact that there's separate builds design acceptance and EGC pre-authorization, sustainability resiliency review going into the loan closing. The design consultation, again, as I mentioned, it's around 12 months before closing. That's when you would be submitting for the design consultation. The submissions, there's a separate design consultation checklist. We do require a consultation. That process does also involve pre-ULURP. So just wanted to flag that if your project happens to be on city-owned property and is doing ULURP, it may be a little bit earlier. Regardless, it's the same checklist. And then during the consultation, the entire development team would be present. That is to say, representation from ownership, architecture, engineering if necessary, along with builds, architecture, engineering, sustainability, resiliency, and of course, program. So we look at the project, we talk through, make sure that the goals are aligned and the project is progressing in a good direction. And then after the design consultation, the document that has been reviewed for the consultation is shared back with all members present. After which, and now focusing specifically on builds and our design review, there are three possible review tracks. One of them is the design review track where after the consultation is complete, a separate intake is created, and I believe my camera is frozen, so I'm going to turn it off. A separate intake is made for a design review. That is a multi-round set of reviews and submissions. So we go through all the requirements for builds design review, usually in 3 rounds or so, get to an approval. A targeted design review. This is one of the new design review tracks in the new guidelines. If your team has an accessibility consultant as part of your team, after we give a full range of accessibility comments during the design consultation, those notes are handed over to the team and their consultant, and then in subsequent submissions and reviews, we will not be looking at accessibility. We found that narrows the scope of what we're looking at considerably and expedites, or it makes the process go faster. A proper expedited design review track actually means that based on the condition of the project during the design consultation, the completeness of the project, the comments that have gone back, and certain parameters of the project. After the consultation, it may require no further builds design review. And in that case, the project would receive the expedited, and then that the expedited design review status would also be a final acceptance. That is all that you would be required for loan closing. Another important tool as part of our updated process is the project summary worksheet. In the past, if you haven't done a project since September, you would be familiar with our PDF summary that's at the beginning of the documents. We have created an Excel spreadsheet. It captures much more of the data about the project. Very useful tool. It includes information that's useful to all of our teams, and we will go into and look at this in more depth in just a moment with some of those teams. I'll turn it over to my colleague Mahan Shirazi to talk about the design requirement updates in this version of the guidelines.
Thank you, Brian. So for those who are familiar with the older version that we had published a few years ago, the design requirement aspect of this new guideline is very limited. The scope of the change is quite minimal in terms of the builds review. My colleagues at Sustainability and Resiliency will go through the changes in their sections, which are, I think, the majority of the updates. But in terms of design, I'll just say that if we are in halfway through May, this will sort of be allowed a transition period for projects that to determine whether they would go through version 1 or 2 of the guidelines. Presumably, if you're here and you're working on a project, it's unlikely they'll be supposed to close by June 30, but if it is, then that would be the exemption. Otherwise, projects that are closing after June 30 will be subject to version 2 of the guidelines. Maybe one sort of organizational change, an update in the guideline is we sort of rearranged the chapters and sections partly to improve the clarity of the guidelines and also to be aligned and consistent with the preservation design guidelines, which were previously published as well. And another maybe aspect that you will notice if you look at it is that we have sort of highlighted the distinction between baseline requirements and REACH criteria, which were before sort of referred to as recommendations, and it wasn't always very clear to teams which is a requirement and which is a recommendation. So we have tried to make that more clear in this version. And you will see we have combined accessibility and age-friendly design. The broadband requirements were there. We just added perhaps more specifics about the technical aspects of the requirements. And we have made minor adjustment to the corridor length, the distance between the farthest unit, and the elevator core. We've learned in several projects that sort of what we had there was maybe not sufficient in certain lot configurations. And for senior buildings, we removed the requirement for emergency pull cord, and we added a requirement for an area of refuge, which the resiliency team will sort of discuss later on. That's really it from the design. We sort of also, I forgot to say, some room measurement method we have updated to be consistent with the way DOB measures the areas. But I'll hand it over to the sustainability team to discuss their chapters.
Okay, so let's dive into the sustainability requirements. First, a few processes and housekeeping stuff. As we know, all new construction projects at minimum must certify with the 2020 Enterprise Green Communities with New York City overlay or LEED v4 Gold. So this is not new, but we updated the HPD Green Building Certification outline on our Enterprise Green Communities webpage, including updated Green Building Certification instructions, the EGC pre-authorization process, and very important, a revamped version of the EGC pre-authorization form, which is now located in the new Design Guidelines workbook and not available as a standalone form anymore. Also, Enterprise released the newest version of New York City overlay, version 2.0, which aligns with our newest design guidelines. So all first-time EGC pre-built submissions as of January 1st must comply with this 2.0 version. Okay. The newest design guideline includes some key sustainability requirements, which I would like to focus on. Also, I'd like to emphasize those that are the items that we typically look for the most during design consultations and reviews. In new construction, as we know, we're looking for all electric buildings. So high efficiency electric heating, cooling, obviously electric, domestic hot water, and appliances, including dryers and cooking appliances. Well, this is a fundamental requirement of our set of requirements. However, we do allow design waivers for projects which encounter challenges with this sort of compliance. Also, there is limitations on the use of electric resistance space heating, as it is highly inefficient and expensive to operate. So for context, in our retrofit projects, we're pushing for conversion of electric resistance to efficient heat pumps wherever possible. So that's why also we are limiting in new construction. So electric resistance backup is generally not permitted, including when used as auxiliary and integrated within the PTHPs. Electric resistance can be used in some of back of the house spaces where other systems would be impractical, but with set limitations on capacities, both for enclosed space and overall in the building. We have specific space heating heat pumps technical requirements, both for split systems and for room heat pumps or PTHPs, which must be followed. And finally, on the HVAC systems, a note about tenant-paid electric space heating and domestic hot water, which are generally not allowed or not allowed in most cases and must meet HPD electric heating policies. We understand that with heat pumps, right, that the split between heating and cooling for building purposes can be challenging. And that is why also we recommend the owners to consider covering cooling costs and take advantage of utility allowances. This and more is better detailed in our underwriting electric and high performance buildings webpage, which I want to highlight, and I recommend checking out. Okay, so there are requirements for electric vehicle charging station for all projects. with both the exterior parking lot and or garages. And also for those, we do allow design waivers. And finally, a note on solar. So as of July 1st, our solar where feasible process or program is not required anymore for new construction projects. And this is because affordable housing will be subject to local law 9294, the solar and green roof local laws, and DOB as of November of this year, and DOB won't accept HPD exemption letters anymore. So all projects, including affordable housing, will have to comply with local law 9294 by either installing solar or a green roof in their sustainable roofing zone. We still want to know about your solar and green roof designs, so that is still going to be a conversation we're going to have during our design consultations. Okay, I'd like now to take a closer look at our new workbook, which, as a reminder, shall be submitted and updated throughout the process for each milestone of our process. So particularly, I would like to go over the design guidelines, new construction green criteria tab, or the green criteria tab, which is shown here, which is organized as a checklist to outline all the sustainability and resiliency requirements, particularly from the guidelines. So let's go over here quickly. At the top, there are instructions on how to fill out the sheet. It is very important to go over this before starting filling it out, so please go over. Also, there is a symbol legend which will help you understand various inputs we included throughout this workbook, such as design waivers, alignment with EGC, and the REACH criteria. As I said, the sheet is organized by criteria, and each line item is numbered consistently with the design guidelines manual, so we include those numbers in the first column. The additional guidance column is also to be checked out with additional notes and full guidance. And so in general, overall, the information in this workbook shall be entered by building, per building, not per project. So mostly are at the building level. And each building in the project will have its own column to be filled out. So here we only see 3, but there are more in the real workbook. A project level summary will auto-populate in the project summary column in gray, like the 4th column. And finally, so as I said, information in the workbook are not to be entered all at once, right? We are preparing for milestone 1. And so to help with that, if we are preparing this for milestone 1, you can filter the line item that you will have to fill out a milestone 1 through that arrow in the blue, dark blue column. Last but not least, a reminder that you only need to fill out blue cells throughout, right? And everything else is locked for a reason. Okay, there are a couple more tabs in the workbook which I wanted to highlight. The design waiver form, the one on the left, which shall be filled out and submitted as early as possible in the process whenever a project is seeking a waiver to waive certain requirements. And then on the right, there is the EGC pre-authorization form. As I said before, this is now located in the workbook and is not available as a standalone form anymore. It is partially automatically populated from the other tabs of the workbook, but teams still will have to enter some of the information. Teams that have been using the old project summary from the beginning of their projects and now need to submit EGC pre-authorization will have to download the new workbook and just use the form from here because there is not anymore available as a standalone. Okay, and I think I'll pass it now to the resiliency team. Alan, you're muted.
Oh, thank you, Julia. Good afternoon, everybody. HPD's design guidelines for new construction establish new resiliency requirements based on best practices and climate projections that are published within the New York City Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines. So the City of New York has maintained these climate resiliency design guidelines now as a design reference for several years. They are intended as design guidelines for city capital projects to incorporate forward-looking climate change data on heat, precipitation, and sea level rise across a project's full useful life. They're intended to guide the design process from project scoping and planning through to final design for all new construction and substantial improvements of city facilities. And following passage of Local Law 41 in 2021, they will also require that by 2027, all city capital projects, including most financed by HPD, meet CRDG requirements that will certify their preparedness for extreme weather threats. And so HPD's design guidelines, our own guidelines, similarly include requirements to address sites that are prone to coastal and stormwater flooding, as well as extreme heat. And I will run through some of these key requirements in the next few slides. So the HPD guidelines require projects that are determined to be flood prone to coastal flooding over their full useful life to incorporate additional resiliency features beyond what building code may currently require. And so to the left, you can see the extent of the 2080s future projected floodplain. In order to screen for these coastal flooding and sea level rise risks, HPD utilizes the New York City Flood Hazard Mapper. Projects that are determined to be at risk of current or future flooding are required to elevate residential units, building egress, and critical residential serving building systems to the 2080s sea level rise adjusted design flood elevation. This sea level rise adjusted design flood elevation, or the SLR adjusted DFE, references the New York City Panel on Climate Change's mid-range projections and aligns with the new building expected useful life criteria as they're published in the Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines. In the and my colleague Michael has dropped the link in to the chat. And those and the HPD guidelines do likewise permit design waivers for some provisions where determined to be appropriate. The HPD guidelines also establish requirements for sites determined to be vulnerable to stormwater flooding over their full useful life. So HPD utilizes the New York City Department of Environmental Protection's stormwater flood maps released in 2021 in order to screen for stormwater flood risks. So to the left, you can see the extent of the 2080s extreme stormwater flood area. Sites that are adjacent to the 2080s extreme stormwater flood area are required to elevate residential units and critical residential serving building systems above grade. The design guidelines also require that applicants demonstrate incorporation of DEP required stormwater management practices across the building and site as required by the city's unified stormwater rule. Likewise, design waivers are available where determined to be appropriate. And finally, the HPD guidelines require projects to meet certain design requirements to reduce the building's contribution to area or neighborhood urban heat island effect, account for increasing temperatures, and ensure occupant thermal safety. HPD utilizes the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene's Interactive Heat Vulnerability Index map to identify high heat vulnerability index neighborhoods. These are identified as neighborhood tabulation areas, or NTAs, that have HVI values of 4 or 5. In particular, projects that are at least 50% senior housing must provide a place of refuge, community space that's accessible to all residents, that includes backup power for heating, cooling, lighting, and other critical support functions, as well as adequate backup power generation, in addition to service for critical and emergency loads, to ensure that at least one elevator remains in operation. Additionally, permanent shaded open space must be provided in high heat risk areas that are not located within a quarter-mile walk distance of dedicated and accessible public space. And this extends to both projects that are at least 50% senior and or other low mobility populations. And with that, I will pass it back to Julia to close us out and lead us into the QA.
Okay, so thank you for listening this far. So what is next? First and foremost, the design consultations. We're aiming to have productive conversations with all of you to discuss challenges from your projects, respond to questions, etc. Please continue to check out resources and updates on our website. And let's not forget the HPD Green Communities training, which are scheduled to happen soon. Also, we have emails where you can reach us for all your questions and throughout the various steps of the process. EGC pre-authorization and solar submission shall go to the Green Communities address. We also have a new sustainability address for sustainability design waivers and questions, and the resiliency address for resiliency design waivers and questions. We're open to leave some time for questions. We are over time, but we can stick around. We can stick around a little bit more. So feel free to, how do we do this? Okay, I think there is a question. Okay, from Chien. I don't know if you can unmute yourself. There are some questions that are being already answered in the chat, but feel free to put more. Chien, I gave you permission to use the microphone if you want to speak out. If there are any other questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand. I don't see anything coming through. We'll give this another couple of minutes. And if not, we can all go back to our Friday plans. Oh,
I see we have a couple of questions, and Julia, just we are scheduled for the next 24 minutes. It's still 1:30, so we have plenty of time.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that there are questions in the chat. I'm not sure why they're not available, why they're not visible. Do you need us to raise our hands? There are a number. There are a few questions in the chat.
Okay, the one I see is, are the limitation of charging tenants for heat for non-HPD funded projects? Is this this is a question from Joel. I'm not sure I understand this question fully.
I'll repeat a question from Heather McKinstry, which was before that. For areas where you have to look at stormwater but not flood, how do you determine how much to raise your units' critical infrastructure?
Yeah, so that question I think was answered by Michael in the chat directly. We can see that. So according to section 2.2a of the design guidelines, sites adjacent to stormwater areas must elevate all residential unit, critical mechanical, electrical, and life safety equipment and controls. Services critical to building function and at least one of egress. But I guess maybe Alan or
it doesn't talk about the height though. I guess the question is, since you don't have a DFE, if you're not in a flood zone, what is the critical height if you're in a stormwater zone?
Sorry, the elevation requirement is to elevate above grade. So essentially, it is to elevate out of a cellar or any other subgrade space to the grade level of the building.
Thank you.
Right, and yeah, it's buried a bit in there, but just to provide a little more context, I think, you know, the way it's interpreted is to you know, identify the broad applicability of where we have grades across the site, and to find a suitable location that would ensure those systems are not at risk of stormwater flooding.
Okay. Does this answer the question?
Yeah.
I also, okay. So going back to the limitation of charging tenants for heat for non-HPD funded projects. We are here in general, we're talking about HPD subsidized projects. So that's the requirement, right? Sorry, that's the policy is applicable for those, if that was the question. Yes, we can see the chat. So Brian Mahan, there is one, if I may ask, could the units that are being used for MIH also be used for tax abatement 405EX? I'm not sure if we are here, the people to respond to this question.
I think that's a question for program, right, when it comes to funding.
Yeah.
Not to be evasive, we want to make sure you get the right information. That's really that's their lane. I wanted to also, Jasmine had asked if everyone can see the chat. There was a note in the chat, somebody that wasn't able to see the full conversation within the chat. I just want to see if that is a problem other people are having as well.
I'm seeing some thumbs up, so it looks like whatever the issue was may have been resolved. So if you can't see the chat, just please do say something in the in the chat. But I'm getting a substantial number of thumbs up, so I think we're good on that side. Thank you.
Great. Right.
Okay, so we have one from Eric. What are the area updates changes that will align more with DOB? I'm not sure I get the context of this question. So maybe if you want to speak up, meantime, we're going to go to the other ones.
Sorry, Julia, I think that has to do with the mechanical units. So basically the area underneath them, for our room area requirements, we do allow that area to be counted, which is the way DOB addresses that too.
Okay. Alan and Michael, there are two about the stormwater requirement. If you haven't read them yet, I'll maybe give you a minute to read through from Alan.
Right, I see them. Thank you. So for a project on 2 or 3 street frontages where one has exposure to the flood risk, we would typically assess the condition across a full building. So it's not usually contingent on the number of intersecting streets where we have the flood ponding showing. If that's the question, if we have multiple buildings on a site, we would likely review them independently, depending on the street frontages that those buildings are located at.
Thank you. That answers the question.
Okay. Regarding the question on the installation of backwater valves and containment tanks, we don't specify a volume of retention. I think we do grant some flexibility to come up with a system to manage sewer backups, backflow prevention that works best for the site. So we don't have that specified in the design guidelines, and when the lowest level is above the DFE or curb, rather when there's no cellar, if that's the implication.
And that's correct.
Right. If there's no DFE or curb, then the backflow preventers would be required to be installed at the lowest level. So it would be the first floor, ground floor of the building. And we have the same requirement for both stormwater and coastal flood prone areas.
And you would still have to provide containment even if your first floor or lowest floor is above any flood levels.
You could, if there is a rationale to do so, a reason to do so, may be required. But again, we offer some discretion there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so there was a question about what is the overlap between the project summary spreadsheet and the EGC form. Again, I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but the EGC pre-authorization form, which is within what we call now the workbook, is in there. And so some of the basic information are pre-populated based on what you put in the rest of the workbook. So like HPD ID, project name, some very basic information, if that was the question. There is a continuation on the one of the area changes. So Mahan, maybe you can take this on. Are these area changes to how we will calculate net and gross floor area, similar to DOB deduction for ZFA?
We have made no other changes to the way we measure the areas in the units, and they're all outlined with diagrams in the guidelines for reference.
Okay, looks like someone still has chat issue, so maybe I'm going to have Jasmine check on that. But meantime, I do want to read a few more questions. So it seems like a sustainability, accessibility, resiliency consultant will soon be mandatory for the design team. So I'm going to speak for the maybe sustainability, resiliency aspect of things. No, it is not mandatory. So in new construction, what is mandatory is to comply either with EGC or LEED. Enterprise Green Communities program, as of now, does not require a third party. Energy Star, though, which is a certification that EGC uses for the energy portion, does need some sort of third-party consultant to go through the full certification. So in that sense, yes, but this has always been the case. So that portion, but HPD per se, we're not requiring necessarily a sustainability consultant or resiliency consultant to be part of the project team. For the accessibility consultant, and maybe Brian or Man, correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea is not that is mandatory. The idea is that teams that do include an accessibility consultant as part of their project team can skip the full review and instead go on a targeted review, which is not going to include the accessibility aspects of the project.
That's about right, with the caveat that you would receive a full review of accessibility in the design consultation, but after that initial feedback, if a team chooses to have an accessibility consultant, then no further comments from builds would be issued. But you're absolutely right. An accessibility consultant is not a requirement.
Yeah, if I can just add, on the resiliency side, we're certainly not we're not aiming to establish a resiliency consultant requirement. The requirements in the design guidelines are they build on best practices that are currently in place already in the city's building code for developments in the special flood hazard area. I think what we are doing here is layering on the direction that we are receiving citywide and really on the federal level to begin to think more closely about how to design buildings to manage climate hazards through their full useful life. And so to that end, the requirements shouldn't be too unfamiliar. But we are also providing additional guidance materials that we expect to have out soon to help designers and developers work through the different publicly available mapping tools we use and understand the specific design references that they reference back to. And just to answer the follow-up question, Chan, that you included about whether New York City flood maps supersede firm maps for DOB submissions, we don't have any formal regulatory New York City flood maps that are not the effective or preliminary flood insurance rate maps. The future projected floodplains, coastal floodplains that we reference in the New York City flood hazard mapper, and the stormwater maps are maps that were developed with the best available climate data to demonstrate some of these future flood hazard conditions. And so we are using them to supplement our guidance. They're not going to be in force for non-HPD projects. The firms still control for those.
Really quickly. Sorry. I was just going to say, before we get to some more chat questions, Michael Todd has had his hand up for quite some time. Yeah, see, we were thinking the same thing. So if you want to unmute, Michael.
Sorry, my question was answered already. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so there was a follow-up on this accessibility consultants question also from Chien. So just to go with the flow, I wanted to wrap up on that. What agency regulates accessibility consultants? Brian or Mahan? Maybe we want to specify what do we mean by accessibility consultant?
Absolutely. So there are established firms who offer and have a history of offering accessibility consultation. Also, any licensed professional, licensed architect or engineer in the state of New York could be sort of could fill that role as an accessibility consultant. So the requirement is simply a sort of you may say a second opinion that would mean that there are two sets of eyes looking at our comments and incorporating them. And of course, if a team doesn't wish to have an accessibility consultant, that simply means that we would be providing those further comments in subsequent iterations of the design review.
Thank you.
There is an interesting question that got also some support from the likes. Is there guidance on determining solar reflectance and thermal emittance for exterior cladding materials? Brick distributor seems unfamiliar with this notion. Yes, so meaning no, there is no specific guidance from our end, meaning it has to be a value that comes from the manufacturer if we're looking for a specific value. I will say in enterprise green communities, the requirements for now are still only on roof. For the exterior cladding on exterior walls, the idea is to prefer light colored cladding, right? So I think that would be the guidance of best practice in avoiding dark colored cladding if a specific value is not available. I don't know if I responded the question correctly, or like if there is any follow-up. Feel free to whoever, Sahar, feel free to put it in the chat or speak up. There is another question. Does the EGC or LEED sustainability requirement applies to all HPD projects, regardless of location, scale, or project types? Example, affordable housing, MIH, or VIH projects. So here we're talking about new construction. So if that was part of the question, yes. Regardless of location, yes, it's regardless of location. Scale or project type. Scale, yes, also is regardless of scale, so smaller or bigger projects. Project types, if you mean by program that is following, I believe that's the case. Yes. So also, yeah, the mandatory voluntary inclusionary housing have an EGC or LEED requirement. Residential or commercial community facilities. So if you mean, if you mean, if a mixed use, so a project where we have residential use, right? And then we have a community facility or retail or whatever is not residential on the ground floor or bottom floors. Those, technically, those spaces will not be certified because enterprise green communities only certified residential use, basically spaces of the buildings used by the tenants. So technically, those are not under the certification, if that's the question. I don't know if Brian Marham, you wanted to add anything here about the mandatory or voluntary inclusionary housing requirements. Also, maybe in terms of the design guidelines as a whole.
First, we had a hand up from Joel before we get to the one in chat. So Joel, please unmute. Can you hear us, Joel? You're still on mute if you are talking.
I'm sorry, do you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so just as a follow-up to the previous answer that the sustainability requirements applies to all projects, including MIH and VIH, even if they're not funded by HPD. So what I had asked earlier about tenant-paid electric space heating and domestic hot water not allowed, you said that would be applicable even though it's not HPD funded. So any typical VIH project, we're providing a certain number of affordable units, those cannot charge. We cannot use the HPD utility allowance if we're using heat pump, climate controlled heat pump heat, and the tenants pay.
I think we'll have to get back to you on that answer, but the simple, and you referred to the question that was just asked, the simple answer to that is that EGC and LEED are requirements for HPD funded new construction, substantial rehab, and gut projects. So we're only talking about HPD funded projects. And then to address your question from earlier about is there a cap for tenant paid heat? I don't think we're the appropriate body to respond to that because we have standards and utility allowances outlined for projects that are requesting funding from our entity, which is HPD. So I don't know if we are the appropriate party to answer that specific question about projects that aren't being funded by HPD. I think you would have to defer to the entity that you are requesting funding from.
Okay, thank you.
So there is a follow-up on the thermal so to the thermal emittance and solar reflectance question. So now maybe I better understand what you're saying. So first of all, in the guidelines, there are two requirements. One is a reach requirement, so it's not mandatory, is to go above and beyond. The other one specify in very high heat facade or south-facing facade, so definitely not the entire building. And it goes up to 0.7, which is not necessarily white. So I would say overall, again, like I understand the challenge in finding the exact number for certain products, but I think the intent here is, again, not having all white walls everywhere, but to prefer lighter colored.
I just want to point out that most of the South Bronx and areas where affordable housing is being built are in the high vulnerable heat areas. It's not so nuanced that like one facade of a building, it would be entire buildings.
In high heat areas, so yes.
Yeah, most of the South Bronx and East New York and all of the neighborhoods that most of the affordable housing funded by HPD is being built is in a high heat vulnerable area. Yeah. And the numbers maybe for thermal emittance, but for SR, which is solar reflectance, it's white, light gray, light, very, very light beige. It's not, it doesn't give you options.
0.6, I wouldn't say is a white, but we can discuss offline about that. But, and also it says again, in high heat areas, especially for south and west facing walls, use exterior wall finishes that are light in color and or exhibit initial solar reflectance, etc. This is, again, I would say the way this is written is to take in with some common sense of, yes, in those high heat areas, which we know that are most of where affordable housing is built for a reason, especially right on south facing wall, because it's unrealistic, right, that the entire building is built in the same way and with those light color preferences, light color or those initial solar reflectances, those value, which again, I don't believe here the intent was to have white walls all over. I'm going to personally double check on those values, but this, I want to reassure that again, it's not the intent to limit to very little shades of exterior cladding. I hope this out, but I'm happy to keep talking about this and maybe I can send out more information. Moving forward, under 5.1, specify concrete block with high supplementary cementitious material content. What does high mean? 10%, 20%, 30%? I will have to get back to you on this, on the specific number. Yes, I don't have an answer right now on the specific percentage of what we mean here by high. Any other questions? We're going to make notes on those questions also as idea for FAQs that we could release. But if not, at this point we are at time. So, oh, and I forgot we had these slides. So I would say thank you everyone for joining. Yes, this presentation will be available. And we hope this was helpful. As I said, please do use the email accounts that are here to ask all of those questions, remind us to respond. And yeah, we hope this was helpful. Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.